Welcome back to the Sampan Viking on China channel. Today I'm going to talk to you about the effects of Brexit on China, and specifically, has Brexit been good for China? Well, that might seem a fairly obscure reference to start with and a fairly obscure subject to connect, but I think this bears some looking at, and I can do so with a little bit of perspective. I am now in that fortunate position to be old enough to remember some of the events I'm going to be discussing, and also fortunate enough not to be so old that I no longer remember the events that I'm going to be discussing. So may that happy state of affairs last for a very, very long time. So I'm going to go back and quickly have a look at the history of the UK within the European Union and how it operated, what its special interests were within the EU, how it came out, and what that means for policy and affects China today, because it's part of global policy. And this is sparked in no small part by the recent AUK-US thingy alliance that's been in the news recently, and the submarine deal and all the rest of it. It all has a connection. It all has an impact. Well, obviously, Britain joined the what was then the Common Market back in 1973. It was presented as joining simply a large free trade zone, and since then, after that, it developed in a more political way than simply a trade bloc. I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of the goods or bads of this, or whether if Brexit was good or bad. It doesn't really matter. The only thing I'm really interested in are the strategic, geopolitical strategic implications of it all. And these are considerable, because the key to all this, the underlying principle that lies behind all of this, is that Britain, in the pursuit, I think, of its perceived special relationship with the USA, was principally America's man in the EU. And that was the key role that it played. And the main result of that was a major strategic victory for the United States in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it was the British government under the John Major premiership that was the driving force in Europe that forced it away from a policy of integration, which was the policy of certainly the French and the Germans, Helmut Kohl and Jacques Delors back in the 80s, who wanted to deepen the European Union, create effectively a federal state of Europe, and instead retain a looser political grouping, but roll it wider, as they called it, not deeper, which essentially meant going against the promises that had been made to Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union, and to actively enroll the former Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern Europe into the European Union, and of course, by extension of that, then to also absorb them into NATO, effectively moving pro-US countries right up to the border of Russia, which has been the cause of many problems since the beginning of the 21st century, and the current dispute with Russia under the premiership of Vladimir Putin. So this was the great strategic victory of the US through this, and it was double-sided. One, it was a massive expansion of its client states right up to the borders of another currently beaten, but also possibly resurgent strategic competitor in the future. It also played a more important part of making sure that the disunited states of Europe did not become a United States of Europe, because a United States of Europe would be a serious strategic competitor to the United States of America. This was something that America was determined to prevent happening, and Britain again was its cat's paw, was its shill in the councils of Europe to make sure this did not happen, and we had widening rather than deepening. So this brings us to the point of what happens now that Britain has left. Well, the obvious thing is that um, Britain is no longer able to play the spoiler within Europe. Now, it meant that back in the 90s, it meant that further political integration was impossible, and you only had to look at the problems that they had with subsidies and free movement in the early days of expansion, where there were major controls on the movement of people, on the ability to claim subsidies of full membership, certainly agricultural subsidies for many of these countries, because the cost of this would have been prohibitive, and the number of people looking to get out of what were then the smashed economies of Eastern Europe to go to the prosperity of the West would have been a major dislocation of people. I mean, there was anyway, but it was a far greater than yeah, it would have been far greater had there been no controls put on it at all. In fact, an interesting parallel is with what happened in China over a similar period, swap Eastern Europe with the Chinese interior, swap Western Europe with the coastal provinces of China, and you saw exactly the same thing. You saw massive internal movement of people moving from the inside of China to find work in the prosperous export factory areas on the coastal provinces, and to the point where they had to start, the Chinese authorities had to start instituting fairly strict internal border controls and Hutu controls in order to make sure that the interior provinces of China were not emptied, and the western coastal province, the eastern coastal provinces, sorry, of China were not utterly swamped by people, and to the point where they could no longer function because they were simply too overpopulated, too much demand on services, etc., and land, etc., etc. So a similar sort of problem with the European Union, and this has persisted for quite a few decades. Where there is a desire on the part of the European Union now to move to fuller integration, it is going to be problematic because they still have elements of the European Union which are going to be difficult to integrate because they are significantly further behind in economic development than areas and the core original members of the EU. And that's not to count problematic countries like Italy or second stage countries like Spain, all the rest of it. There are massive problems on there. And in a sense, a lot of this is self-generating because you have an EU at the moment that is neither one thing nor the other. It isn't a simple free trade zone. It isn't a full political union. It's a halfway house that has, I would say, the disadvantages of both states of existence, and very few of the advantages of either. This clearly is recognized by many of the pro-integrationist leading politicians, certainly in France and Germany. Um, and worth saying again is that the euro has also, as indeed was the exchange rate mechanism beforehand, illustrated many of these weaknesses, how they could be manipulated by outside forces. As a Brit, I remember '92 and Black Monday, and when Britain bombed out of the exchange rate mechanism, and similar things, the financial crisis that have happened in Europe due to the euro, due to the fact that because they were still a collection of states all using a single currency, they weren't able to harmonize so many other things, which would have taken away many of the distortions inside the internal market that having separate policies in separate countries produced. At the end of the day, a single currency without a single set of policies is going to cause problems. I mean, you could have them even when you have a single set of policies, but I think they are greater, I think they are exacerbated, and I think that the results of what happens, certainly with countries like Greece, like Italy, and some other countries as well, speaks volumes. It is not one size fits all. You either each have the same policies so that everybody can react accordingly, or you do not. Well, now this is all over. Britain has left, and Europe has an opportunity now to start deepening again, and it looks as though it is. And it is, I think, an illustration that there are growing tensions between Europe and the United States, with Britain still choosing to make itself the poodle that could be kicked by both sides. Well, what a happy position that is to be in. We've seen this, I think, in quite starkly with the recent announcement on the submarines, where Britain, America has teamed up with Australia, principally in relation to the Asia Pacific, saying that America saying, as I've been saying all along, their interest now is purely in the Asia Pacific. They have no real interest in Europe, and they do not mind doing the nasty all over a former European ally. Now, of course, France is a major player within the European Union, and so you start to wonder whether or not that the stance of France is being supported widely by the European Union. If it is, this is something that I touched on the previous video with, China can hit back on the subject of Gibraltar. This could well be a major opening in a divide between Europe and the USA, which again is exacerbated by talk of Europe taking on a greater defence role and in an individual European identity defence force, again starting to undermine the role of NATO, where the United States was the undisputed chief and all the other smaller states were simply satraps. Uh, so again, this part is a split, as America seems to be disengaging itself from everywhere in the world except from the Asia Pacific, and taking along those allies that are still deemed useful to operate in areas where they may still be deemed as useful. And I think those useful areas are going to diminish over time. Interesting, France did point out that France is actually still a Pacific power. It does have possessions in the Pacific, unlike the UK. And again, this could also be seen as a way of sidelining a potential rival, because if the European Union does become a federal republic, then presumably those French possessions in the Pacific will also by extension become part of the European Union. And that would be the presence, the unwelcome presence from the United States perception of a rival strategic competitor in an area that it regards as its exclusive backyard. Very, very interesting. Britain's role in this, it's difficult to see what Britain gets out of this. I think Britain is very much the little man who's trying to talk big. The little weedy character that hides behind the big friend, making all the big talk, trying to start the trouble. Sadly, that's how Britain comes along. What justifies a British vote, a British seat at the Permanent Security Council? I do not know. You'd have thought that the Permanent Security Council should represent major ability to exert power. It should be either a very rich country, an extremely militarily strong country, or an extremely populous country. So, in one sense, representing something significant in terms of global potential on the earth. And Britain, frankly, does none of these. You could say the same about France as well, except that France can now say that, as I'm sure it would become the European Union vote. Well, what does Britain do? Well, at the moment, Britain gives America a second vote. Simple as that, which is pretty pointless. There are other countries out there that actually have a far greater claim for qualifying for having an effect on global affairs. Britain came out of it. This is a legacy from a world ago, when the British Empire still existed and we were the victors of World War II. So much more, so much now has changed. It is frankly delusional to believe that Britain still has the standing in the world to be able to warrant representing such a powerful instrument in global affairs. It doesn't warrant it. It doesn't have the ability to back up what it votes for on its own right, which is essentially what the Permanent Security Council members should be able to do in one way or another. So, is this good for China? Well, yes, it is. It means that rather than the West being this totally unified hostile force, if it's now going to split into two forces, it will be a force in Europe, I think, that will be considerably less hostile overall than America, which simply sees it as a strategic competitor, and in fact, a Europe that becomes itself a strategic competitor of the United States, is a potential ally in many areas in order to help contain a lunatic United States, I think is the easiest way to do it. Russian-European relations are actually not that bad, and many in Europe would like to see relations improve. China and Russia have a strategic partnership that's out, and I think Europe would like to have closer ties with the members of that strategic partnership, and very much resent, I think, how America has interfered in its internal affairs, as it's interfered in the internal affairs of virtually every other country over the course of the last 70 years or so. Well, that's a rather longer video than I was expecting. I hope I've covered all the bits that I meant to. I can always revisit later if I didn't. If you enjoyed this video, please like. If you are not a subscriber, please do. It costs nothing and it helps the channel to grow. Ring the bell so you'll be notified of all new video releases. And if you'd like other people to listen to what I have to say, please share. If you would like to express an opinion or make any other comment about the content of this video, please leave a comment and I'll be delighted to reply where appropriate. Thank you very much, and I hope you will be joining me in the next video in the not too distant future.